The wine glass shattered against the polished floor, and in that moment of silence, Jean Lovell saw what no one else could. A child drowning in grief while a room full of adults looked away. She watched from the kitchen doorway as 4-year-old Melissa Daniel stood in the center of the dining hall, her small body trembling with sobs that echoed through Le Verre door like a storm breaking against stone. Her face was streaked with tears, and her tiny fists were clenched so tight that her knuckles had gone bone white against her pale skin. "I want my mama!" The little girl's scream sliced through the air. "Where's Mama?" Around Jean, the waitstaff backed away, their faces drained of color. She'd heard the whispers during her first week in the kitchen about what happened when someone interfered with the boss's daughter. 2 servers had been fired last month for simply looking at her too long. The sous chef had been reassigned after accidentally making the girl cry. The head sommelier walked on eggshells every night. But Jean couldn't move. She couldn't tear her eyes away from the broken child surrounded by crystal and silence. Then she heard it. The sound that made every spine in the restaurant go rigid. Footsteps. Heavy, deliberate, lethal. Nicholas Daniel emerged from his private booth, his tall frame, casting a shadow that seemed to swallow the candlelight. His dark eyes swept the scene, taking in the shattered glass, the frozen staff, and his daughter's tear-stained face. The air itself seemed to thicken, pressing down on everyone's lungs. Jean knew she should stay silent. She was just the pastry chef who'd been hired 3 weeks ago after the last one quit without explanation. She had no business stepping into this moment. But as Melissa's sobs grew more desperate, something ancient inside her stirred. Something from the monastery. From years of sitting with suffering, from a vow she'd once made to serve the wounded. She took a step forward. What happened next would change 3 lives forever. Before we continue, let me ask you something. Have you ever seen a child in so much pain that it shattered something inside you? Have you ever known that helping might cost you everything, but your hands moved anyway? That's exactly where Jean Lavelle found herself. She was a woman who'd left the monastery with nothing but the clothes on her back and calluses on her palms from kneading bread in silence for 6 years. This position at Le Verre d'Or was supposed to be her fresh start, a way back into the world without anyone asking too many questions. The pay was enough to cover her tiny studio apartment in the Tenderloin and keep her far from the violence that had driven her from her vows. But watching that little girl suffer, standing in the shadow of the most dangerous man in the city, sometimes the soul doesn't negotiate with survival. Jean Lovell had grown up in Oakland, in a neighborhood where you learned early to keep your head down and your hands clean. She knew the rules. She knew that men like Nicholas Daniel, men whose names made hardened criminals cross the street, weren't to be challenged. Yet as she looked at Melissa, all she saw was a child whose world had ended, crying in a room full of people too afraid to love her. Keep reading to discover what Jean did next, and how one gentle touch would not only calm a mafia boss's daughter, but capture the attention of a man who'd forgotten what mercy looked like. Will Jean's compassion be her salvation, or the thing that destroys her? 3 weeks earlier, Jean had stood outside the service entrance of Le Verre d'Or, her worn Converse sneakers stark against the pristine white marble steps. The restaurant loomed before her like a cathedral of glass and gold, all floor-to-ceiling windows and chandeliers that probably cost more than she'd earned in her entire life. She'd almost walked away. The job listing had been vague. Head pastry chef needed, immediate start, exceptional pay, discretion, essential. Only when she'd arrived for the interview did the head chef mention in passing that the owner was Nicholas Daniel. The name alone made Jean's stomach drop. But her bank account had 43 euros in it, her landlord had started leaving notes under her door, and the monastery wouldn't take her back, not after what she'd seen, what she'd run from. She needed this job, no matter whose money signed her checks. The head chef, a severe Frenchwoman named Margot, had been blunt during the interview. Monsieur Daniel values 2 things, perfection and invisibility. You create beautiful desserts, you stay out of sight. You don't ask questions about the clientele. She'd paused, her voice dropping. His daughter, Melissa, lost her mother 6 months ago. The child is inconsolable. Stay in the kitchen. Stay away from her. Jean had nodded, swallowed every question burning in her throat, and accepted the position. Now, on her 3rd week, she was beginning to understand what inconsolable meant. She'd been pulling a tray of chocolate soufflés from the oven when she heard the first crash from the dining room. Then shouting, A woman's voice, strained and desperate. "Melissa, sweetheart, please, you have to calm down." "No, no, I want Mama. Where's Mama?" Jean's hands stilled on the oven door. That voice, so small, so utterly shattered. "Your father's trying to enjoy his meal. You're upsetting the guests." "I don't care. I hate him. I hate everyone here." Another crash. The sound of running feet. A door slamming. The head server, Marcus, burst through the kitchen door, his face flushed. "She's thrown her water glass at a client. Get a mop." He disappeared back into the chaos without waiting for a response. Jean knew she should return to her souffle, should mind her business like Margot had instructed. But her feet carried her toward the kitchen door instead, toward the sound of that broken little voice. She pushed it open just a crack. The dining room was a study in frozen horror. Guests sat rigid at their tables, pretending not to see. Servers pressed themselves against walls. And in the center of it all, beneath the golden glow of crystal chandeliers, stood Melissa Daniel. She was so small, too small to contain all that pain. Her white dress was soaked down the front, her dark blonde hair tangled around her face. She clutched a stuffed rabbit in one hand, its ear torn, its fur matted from being held too tight for too long. Jean's heart cracked clean in half. She'd grown up without a father, raised by a grandmother who worked 3 jobs just to keep the lights on. She knew what it felt like to have a hole in your life that nothing could fill. But to lose a mother at 4 years old, to be surrounded by wealth and power, but starve for a single gentle touch. She let the door swing closed and stepped fully into the dining room. The movement drew every eye. Marcus's face went white. Margot, visible through the service window, made a sharp cutting gesture across her throat. "Stop. Go back." But Jean walked forward anyway, her white chef's coat bright against the darkness of the room. "Sweetheart," she said softly, kneeling down several feet from the trembling child. "You don't have to shout. I can hear you just fine." Melissa's sobs stuttered. Her head turned, eyes wide and red-rimmed, searching Jean's face for the anger she'd learned to expect. Around them, the silence deepened. Every gaze turned toward the black woman in white who'd just dared to approach Nicholas Daniel's daughter. Jean heard the scrape of a chair, heavy, deliberate. She didn't have to look up to know Nicholas had risen from his booth, his towering frame casting its shadow across the room. She could feel his attention like a weight against her spine. But she didn't move. She stayed kneeling, her dark hands resting gently on her knees, her voice soft as a prayer. "It's okay to be sad," Jean said. "It's okay to miss someone. You're allowed to feel everything you're feeling." Melissa's bottom lip trembled. Who are you?" "My name's Jean. I make the desserts here. The chocolate ones you didn't eat yesterday." "You're going to get in trouble," the little girl whispered. "Papa doesn't like when people talk to me." Jean glanced up then, just for a moment, meeting Nicholas Daniel's eyes across the room. They were dark, unreadable, carved from the same stone as the rest of him. But in the pause before he could speak, before he could order her away or worse, she saw something flicker behind that coldness. Recognition. Not of her face, but of her audacity. She looked back at Melissa and smiled softly. "Maybe, but I heard you were hurting, and I thought maybe you could use someone who understands." "Understands what?" "What it's like when someone leaves and doesn't come back." The words hung in the air, delicate and dangerous. Melissa took a small step forward. "Your mama left too?" "My daddy," Jean said gently. "Different kind of leaving, I know. But I remember what it feels like there's a piece of you missing, and no one knows how to help you find it." Another step. Melissa's small fingers loosened their death grip on the rabbit. "Does it stop hurting?" she whispered. Jean's throat tightened. Behind her, she heard Nicholas's sharp intake of breath, the first sound he'd made since standing. "It stops hurting so much," Jean said honestly, "but only if you let people help carry it with you. You don't have to carry it alone." Melissa's face crumpled. Fresh tears spilled down her cheeks, but this time, when Jean slowly extended her hand palm up, an invitation, not a demand, the little girl took it. The moment their fingers touched, Melissa's trembling stopped. The entire room exhaled as one. Jean didn't look at Nicola, didn't acknowledge the way his jaw had gone tight or how his knuckles had gone white against the table edge. She simply held the child's hand and murmured, There, that's better, isn't it? Melissa nodded, then shocked everyone by stepping fully into Jean's arms. It was the first time anyone had seen her stop crying in 6 months. The rest of dinner service passed in a blur of whispers. Jean had carried Melissa back to the kitchen, the child still clinging to her neck, her sobs reduced to hiccups, and settled her on a stool near the pastry station. She'd given the girl a wooden spoon and a bowl of cream to whip, a simple task to keep small hands busy. Melissa had worked in silence, her eyes red-rimmed but focused, while Jean finished plating desserts under the weight of 100 stares. No one spoke to her. Not Margot, whose face had gone from furious to carefully blank. Not Marcus, who avoided her section of the kitchen entirely. The other line cooks moved around her like she was radioactive, their glances quick and nervous. Only Melissa seemed oblivious to the tension, humming softly as she stirred. When Nicholas's bodyguard appeared in the kitchen doorway, 6'4" of muscle and expensive suit, Jean's hands stilled on the chocolate she'd been tempering. "Monsieur Daniel requests your presence," the man said, his accent thick, his expression unreadable. "Now." Margot sucked in a sharp breath. Across the kitchen, a pot clattered to the floor. Jean set down her spatula and untied her apron with steady fingers. She wouldn't give them the satisfaction of seeing her hands shake. "Watch the ganache," she told one of the calmest chefs. "If it splits, start over." Then she followed the bodyguard into the corridor. The private dining room was on the second floor, accessible only by a narrow staircase that smelled of old wood and older money. Jean had never been up here. The kitchen staff wasn't allowed past the main floor unless explicitly summoned. The bodyguard knocked twice, waited for a low voice to grant entry, then opened the door and stepped aside. Jean walked in alone. The room was smaller than she'd expected, intimate in a way that felt deliberate. Dark mahogany paneling absorbed the light from a single chandelier. A table set for two sat in the center, though only one place had been used, Nicholas's, judging by the empty wine glass and the meal that had gone cold. Nicholas Daniel stood by the window, his back to her, hands clasped behind him. He was still in his suit from dinner, but he'd loosened his tie. Even in partial silhouette, his presence filled the room like smoke. "Close the door," he nodded, without turning. Jean did. The click of the latch sounded too loud. Silence stretched between them. Jean stood with her hands folded in front of her, waiting. She'd learned patience in the monastery, how to sit with discomfort, how to breathe through fear. She used those skills now. Finally, Nicholas turned. Up close, without the chaos of the dining room between them, he was even more imposing. Tall, broad-shouldered, with the kind of face that had been carved by violence and refined by power. His dark eyes studied her with an intensity that made her feel dissected. "Sit," he said, gesturing to the chair opposite his. Jean sat. She didn't let herself fidget. Nicholas moved to his own chair, lowering himself into it with the controlled grace of a predator. He poured himself another glass of wine, something red and undoubtedly expensive, but didn't offer her any. He simply watched her over the rim as he drank. "Jean Lavelle," he said finally, 26, from Oakland, no family. Worked in a monastery kitchen for 6 years before coming here 3 weeks ago. He set down his glass. "The background check I ran before hiring you was thorough, but it didn't tell me who sent you." Jean's pulse quickened, but her voice stayed calm. "No one sent me. People don't approach my daughter. They know better." His tone was conversational, but his eyes were flint. "Yet you walked right up to her, touched her, like you had every right." "I saw a child in pain," Jean said simply, "and that's all." "That's all?" Nikolai leaned forward slightly, his presence pressing into the space between them. "You risk your job, possibly your life, because you saw a child in pain?" "Yes." He stared at her for a long moment. Jean held his gaze, refusing to look away. She'd faced down silence and meditation cells. She'd sat with suffering that would break most people. This man might be dangerous, but he wasn't the most frightening thing she'd ever encountered. Something flickered in Nicholas's eyes, surprise maybe, or respect. "Why did she stop crying?" he asked, and for the first time, his voice carried something other than threat. It carried confusion, helplessness. "Because I didn't try to fix her." Jean said quietly. I just let her feel what she was feeling. Sometimes that's all a person needs, permission to hurt. Nicholas's jaw tightened. He looked away toward the window, and for a moment, Jean glimpsed the man beneath the armor, a father who'd watched his daughter suffer for 6 months and didn't know how to reach her. When he spoke again, his voice was carefully controlled. I want you to cook for her, privately. Breakfast, lunch when she's home, dinner, whatever she needs. Jean's stomach dropped. Monsieur Daniel, the pay is triple what you're making now. You'll have your own kitchen space in my home. Access to anything you require. That's not... Are you refusing? The question hung in the air like a blade. Jean's mind raced. Her rent was 2 months overdue. Her landlord had started proceedings. She'd been eating the restaurant's leftovers to save money. This job could change everything. Give her stability, breathing room, a chance to build a real life outside the monastery's shadows. But entanglement with Nicholas Daniel came with a price she couldn't calculate. She could see it in the way his men moved, in the fear that followed him like cologne. One wrong move, one perceived betrayal, and she'd disappear like the last pastry chef. Still. Melissa's face flashed in her mind. Those red-rimmed eyes, that desperate grip on a stuffed rabbit. I'll do it, Jean heard herself say. But only for her, not for you. Nicholas's mouth curved. Not quite a smile, but close. Understood. You start tomorrow. He stood, signaling the meeting was over. Jean rose as well. She was halfway to the door when his voice stopped her. Jean. She turned. Nicholas was watching her again, his expression unreadable. What you did tonight, no one has dared that in 6 months. My men will talk. Some of them won't like it, he paused. Be careful. It wasn't a threat. It was a warning. Jean nodded once and left. In the restaurant's back alley, 3 of Nicholas's men shared a cigarette and low conversation. Did you see that? The youngest, Carlo, shook his head. She just walked right up to the kid. Boss didn't even move, muttered Enzo, the head of security, and just watched. The third man, Victor, was older, with scars that told stories. He took a long drag and exhaled slowly. You know what that means. What? The boss let a woman touch his daughter and live. Victor flicked ash into the darkness. That makes her dangerous. To who? Carlo asked. Victor smiled without humor. To everyone. Inside, in a kitchen still humming with nervous energy, Jean washed her hands and tried not to think about what she'd just agreed to. But her fingers remembered the feel of Melissa's small hand in hers. And despite everything, she knew she'd made the right choice, even if it killed her. The Daniel estate wasn't a home. It was a fortress dressed in marble and glass. Jean arrived at dawn with a single duffel bag containing everything she owned. The gates opened silently, swallowing her rental car into a driveway that curved through manicured gardens where nothing grew wild. The house itself rose like a monument to control, all clean lines and floor-to-ceiling windows that reflected the sky without revealing what lay inside. A housekeeper named Teresa met her at the side entrance. Kitchen's this way. Your quarters are upstairs, third door on the left. Melissa wakes at 7. No welcome, no small talk, just directions delivered in the clipped tone of someone who'd, learned not to get attached to new staff. Jean followed her through hallways lined with abstract art worth more than most people's houses. Everything was pristine, sterile, the kind of beautiful that forbade touch. The kitchen, at least, felt like sanctuary. It was massive. Commercial-grade appliances, marble countertops, copper pots hanging from racks like church bells. Morning light poured through windows overlooking a garden where rosemary grew in neat rows. Jean set down her bag and ran her fingers along the butcher block island, feeling the grain of the wood. This she could work with. Melissa appeared at 7:03, clutching her rabbit, her hair still tangled from sleep. She wore pink pajamas with clouds on them and stood in the doorway like she wasn't sure she was allowed to enter. Good morning, sweetheart, Jean said softly, not moving from where she stood whisking eggs. Are you hungry? Melissa nodded. What would you like? I can make anything. Anything? Anything in the world. The little girl considered this seriously. Pancakes, but she hesitated. The other cooks always made them wrong. They were too flat. Jean smiled. Ah, you like them fluffy. Really fluffy. Then fluffy it is. She worked while Melissa watched from a stool, explaining each step as she went. The separation of eggs, the gentle folding of whipped whites into batter, the patience required to let bubbles form before flipping. Melissa leaned forward, fascinated, her rabbit forgotten on the counter, when Jean slid the plate across. 3 perfect golden circles stacked high. Melissa's eyes went wide. "They're like clouds," she whispered. "Try one." The first bite made her giggle. Actually giggle, a sound like bells, bright and unexpected in the quiet kitchen. Jean's chest tightened. When was the last time someone had fed this child with love instead of obligation? The monastery kitchen had been stone and silence. Jean had spent 6 years there, rising at 4 for morning prayers, then descending into the basement, where she'd learned to make bread for 70 monks without speaking a word. Sister Margaret had taught her that cooking was meditation, each fold of dough a prayer, each measured ingredient an act of devotion. "We feed the body to quiet the mind," Sister Margaret would sign in the language they'd developed. "We feed the mind to open the soul." Jean had believed it, had built her life around that silence, that service, had thought she'd found peace, until the night the men came. She'd been alone, finishing the next day's prep, when she heard the shouting from the chapel. Running feet. A scream that cut off too suddenly. She'd hidden in the cold storage, pressed between hanging sides of beef, while boots thundered overhead. The gunshots had been thunder without warning, 3 of them, sharp and final. She'd found Brother Thomas in the chapel afterward, his blood spreading across the altar cloth. He'd been 62. He'd taught her how to proof dough in winter. The police said it was a robbery, a mistake. Wrong place, wrong time. But Jean had seen the way they looked at each other when they said it, had heard what they didn't say, that the monastery was in the wrong neighborhood, served the wrong people, offered sanctuary to those who needed it without asking questions. She'd left the next morning. Couldn't pray in a place where violence had shattered silence. Couldn't be still when stillness had gotten someone killed. Her calm hadn't survived that night. It had been forged by it. "Jean, can you teach me?" Melissa's voice pulled her back. The child was pointing at the leftover pie dough Jean had made for dinner prep. Butter and flour waiting to be rolled. "You want to learn to make pastry?" Enthusiastic nodding. Jean pulled a smaller rolling pin from a drawer and dusted the marble with flour. She showed Melissa how to press gently, how to turn the dough in quarter rotations, how to feel when it was right. Melissa's first attempt was lumpy and uneven, but she was so focused, her tongue poking between her teeth in concentration, that Jean felt something warm expand in her chest. "Like this?" Melissa asked, rolling with her whole body. "Just like that. You're a natural." The giggle again. Louder this time. Melissa's hands were white with flour, her pajamas dusted, a smear across her cheek where she'd scratched her nose. She looked like a child. Not a mafia boss's daughter. Not a grief-stricken tragedy. Just a 4-year-old making a mess in a kitchen with someone who cared. Neither of them noticed Nicholas in the doorway. He stood perfectly still, one hand braced against the frame, watching his daughter laugh. The sound seemed to physically affect him, his jaw working, his shoulders rigid like he was bracing against a blow. How long had it been since he'd heard that sound? Jean glanced up, sensing his presence. Their eyes met across the kitchen. She saw something raw in his face before he could lock it away. Grief, wonder, something that looked almost like pain. He didn't speak, just watched as Melissa showed him her misshapen dough circle with pride. "Papa, look, I made it myself." "I see." His voice was rough. "It's good. Jean says I'm a natural." His eyes flicked to Jean again. She read the question there. "How did you do this?" She had no answer, just shrugged slightly and turned back to Melissa's lesson. That night, Nicholas asked Jean to join them for dinner. "I'm just the chef, Monsieur Daniel," she said, already plating his ribeye. "Nicholas," he corrected, "and Melissa wants you there. Melissa needs stability. Not, please." The word sounded foreign in his mouth, like he'd forgotten how to use it. Jean looked past him to where Melissa sat at the dining table, swinging her legs, hopeful. She sighed. "Just tonight." But it wasn't just that night. The next evening, Nicholas asked again, and the next, until sitting down with them became routine. Jean at the end of the long table, Melissa chattering between bites, Nicholas silent but present. Jean told herself it meant nothing, that she was fulfilling her job, nothing more. But she felt Nicholas's eyes on her when she spoke to Melissa, felt the weight of his attention like gravity. And she knew, the way she'd known in the monastery kitchen when the silence broke, that peace never lasted, that eventually every sanctuary fell. She just hadn't expected to care so much when it did. The dining room had been transformed for war. That's what it felt like to John, watching from the kitchen as Nicholas's men arranged themselves around the table like pieces on a chessboard. 6 of them, all in expensive suits that couldn't quite hide the violence in their eyes. They moved with the careful politeness of predators forced to share territory. "Stay close to Melissa," Nicholas had told her that morning, his voice low. "She doesn't do well with strangers." Now Jean understood why. Melissa sat between her father and an empty chair meant for Jan, her small hands folded too tightly in her lap. She was wearing a navy dress, formal, uncomfortable, and her rabbit had been left upstairs. The child looked like she was trying to disappear into the velvet cushion. Jean entered with the first course, setting plates down with practiced efficiency. The men barely glanced at her. To them, she was invisible, just another servant. But Nicholas's eyes tracked her movements. When she set Melissa's plate down, she let her hand rest briefly on the girl's shoulder. A silent message. "I'm here." Melissa's rigid posture softened slightly. Dinner progressed with the rhythm of a hostage negotiation. The men spoke in coded language about shipments and territories, their voices pleasant, their smiles sharp. Nicholas presided over it all with the calm of a man who knew he held every card. Melissa pushed food around her plate, growing more restless with each course. Her legs swung faster under the table. Her fingers drummed against her thigh. Jean recognized the signs. She'd seen them every night this week when Melissa got overwhelmed, the telltale fidgeting before the storm. By the time Jean brought out the main course, Melissa's breathing had quickened. One of the men, a silver-haired Russian named Dmitri, was telling a story that involved too much laughter, too much noise. The sound scraped against the child's nerves like sandpaper. "Papa," Melissa whispered, tugging Nicholas's sleeve. "Papa, I don't feel good." Nicholas's hand covered hers, but his attention stayed on Dmitri. "In a moment, Piccola." "Papa, please." "Melissa." His voice carried warning. "Not now." The little girl's eyes filled with tears. Jean moved without thinking. She circled the table, pulled out the empty chair beside Melissa, and sat down. The men's conversation faltered. Nicholas's jaw tightened, but he didn't stop her. "Hey," Jean murmured, leaning close so only Melissa could hear. "It's loud in here, isn't it?" Melissa nodded, a tear spilling over. "I know. Sometimes people forget that loud sounds can hurt." Jean took the child's hand under the table, hidden from view. "Do you remember the song I taught you? The one about the mockingbird?" Another nod. "Close your eyes just for a second. Listen only to me." Melissa's eyes fluttered shut. Jean began to hum, low, soft, barely audible beneath the conversation. An old spiritual her grandmother used to sing, something about troubled waters and coming home. She didn't know all the words anymore. But the melody was carved into her bones. Melissa's breathing slowed. Her grip on Jean's hand loosened from desperate to simply holding. The men at the table fell silent, one by one. Dimitri's story died mid-sentence. They all turned, these hardened criminals, to stare at the black woman humming to a child like she'd forgotten they existed. Jean kept her eyes on Melissa, ignoring them. The song continued, each note measured, each breath deliberate. The kind of music that came from someplace deeper than training, from the part of her that remembered sitting in her grandmother's lap, safe before the world taught her to be afraid. When the last note faded, the dining room was completely still. Melissa opened her eyes. "Better?" Jean asked softly. "Better," the child whispered. Nicholas stared at Jean like she'd performed a miracle, or a magic trick he couldn't figure out. Dmitri cleared his throat. "Your chef," he said to Nicholas, his Russian accent thick with something like awe. "She is unusual." "Yes," Nicholas said quietly. "She is." The guests left an hour later, their business concluded, their steps heavy with wine and unspoken questions. Jean heard them murmuring as they passed through the foyer. Did you see that? The boss's daughter. She stayed in the kitchen, scrubbing pans that didn't need scrubbing, waiting for the house to empty. When Nicholas appeared in the doorway, she wasn't surprised. He'd shed his suit jacket, loosened his tie. Exhaustion lined his face, the kind that came from wearing masks all night. He poured himself a whiskey from the bottle she kept for deglazing, then leaned against the counter, watching her. Who taught you to silence storms? He asked. Jean didn't look up from the pan. Years of learning to listen. That's not an answer. It's the only one I have. Nicholas took a slow sip. My men are trained killers. They've seen things that would break most people, and tonight they sat in silence, listening to you hum. He paused. How? Maybe they needed it too, Jean said simply. She finally met his eyes. Maybe everyone in that room was tired of being hard. Something shifted in Nicholas's expression. He set down his glass and moved closer, close enough that she could smell his cologne, something dark and expensive that probably cost more than her monthly salary. She hasn't smiled for anyone else, he said quietly. Not the nannies, not the therapists, not me. Only you. Children know who's safe. And am I? The question came out rough. Safe? Jean turned fully to face him. They were standing too close now, the island the only thing between them. I don't know. Are you? Nicholas's jaw worked. My wife died in a car accident. 6 months, 2 weeks, 3 days ago. The specificity cut like glass. Melissa was in the back seat. She watched her mother bleed out before the ambulance arrived. Jean's breath caught. Oh, God. The child had been there. The doctor said she'll forget eventually. That trauma doesn't stick at that age. Nicholas's laugh was bitter. But every night she screams for her. Every morning she asks when Mama's coming home, and his voice broke. I don't know how to help her. You're here, Jean said softly. That's something. Is it? Because most nights I wonder if she'd be better off without me. Without this life. He gestured vaguely at the house, the empire built on violence. Everything I touch turns to ash. Not everything. Their eyes locked. The air between them thickened. You left the monastery, Nicholas said, changing directions. Why? Jean's hands stilled in the dishwater. Someone I cared about died, violently, in a place that was supposed to be sacred. She pulled her hands free, dried them slowly. I couldn't pray after that. Couldn't be still. Silence felt like complicity. So you ran? Yes, and found yourself in another violent man's home. His smile was self-deprecating. Interesting choice. Maybe I'm tired of running. The words hung between them, heavier than she'd intended. Nicholas moved around the island, slowly giving her time to step back. She didn't. He stopped close enough that she could see the flecks of gold in his dark eyes, the scar that cut through his left eyebrow, close enough to feel dangerous. Jean. Her name in his mouth sounded like a prayer, like a question. Monsieur Daniel. Nicolas, this isn't... She didn't know how to finish. Wasn't what? Appropriate, safe, already too late? His hand lifted, hovering near her face, not quite touching. You make her laugh. You silence storms. His voice dropped to barely a whisper. Who are you? Just a chef, Jean said, but her voice wavered. Liar! Before either of them could cross the line, shimmering between them, footsteps echoed in the hallway. Nicholas stepped back just as Teresa appeared with an armful of linens. The housekeeper's eyes flicked between them, reading everything, saying nothing. Melissa's asking for Jean, bedtime. Jean nodded gratefully and moved toward the door, her heart hammering. As she passed Nicholas, she felt the whisper of his hand at the small of her back. There and gone so quickly she might have imagined it, but she didn't imagine the way his eyes followed her out. In the garden, hidden in shadow, Victor lit a cigarette and watched the kitchen window. He'd seen the way the boss looked at her, like a man starving. He'd seen her walk away, the boss still staring after her like she'd stolen something he didn't know he had. This was worse than he'd thought. The chef wasn't just a distraction, she was becoming necessary. And necessary people had power. Power that could undermine everything they'd built. Victor took a long drag and made a decision. Something would have to be done. The change came slowly, like water turning to ice. Jean felt it first in the silences. The way conversations died when she entered a room. How the guards who used to nod politely now watched her with flat, assessing eyes, and the housekeeper who'd been warming to her suddenly found reasons to leave whenever Jean appeared. She told herself she was imagining it. But on her fifth morning in the estate, she found her bedroom door scratched, three parallel lines gouged into the wood like claw marks. No explanation, no apology, just Teresa grimly repainting it while Jean stood there, her stomach churning. Probably nothing, Teresa said without meeting her eyes. Old house, things settle. Houses didn't settle in straight lines. That afternoon, Jean overheard Victor and two other men smoking on the terrace just outside the kitchen window. She'd been chopping vegetables, trying to lose herself in the rhythm, when their voices drifted in. Don't trust her. She shows up out of nowhere. And suddenly the boss is canceling meetings to eat dinner with his kid? Could be a plant. Conti family's been looking for a weakness. Or worse, federal. Remember what happened to Sal? His maid was wired for 6 months before anyone caught on. Jean's knife stilled against the cutting board. Boss won't listen, Victor said, his voice hard with frustration. I told him we should run deeper background, but he looks at me like I'm the problem, like I'm trying to hurt the kid instead of protect him. He's compromised. He's soft, and soft men get killed. The words hung in the air like gun smoke. Jean set down her knife with trembling hands. She wasn't naive. She'd known working for Nicholas came with danger. But hearing herself discussed like a threat, like an enemy combatant, she looked down at the vegetables she'd been preparing for Melissa's lunch. Organic carrots shaped like stars, the child's favorite. How had her life come to this? From monastery kitchens to feeding a mafia boss's daughter while his men planned what? Her removal? Her elimination? She could leave. Should leave. Pack her single duffel bag and disappear before the situation imploded. But even as the thought formed, she knew she wouldn't. The next morning, Melissa appeared in the kitchen doorway earlier than usual, her rabbit clutched tight, her face worried. Jean? Her voice was small. Are you leaving? Jean's hands stilled on the espresso machine. What? No, sweetheart. Why would you think that? I heard Teresa talking. She said you wouldn't last. That nobody does, Melissa's bottom lip trembled. Papa's gonna make you go away like all the others. Jean knelt down, eye level with the child. I'm not going anywhere. Promise? The word was a trap, a vow she had no business making. Jean had learned in the monastery that promises were sacred. You didn't offer them unless you were willing to die keeping them. But looking at Melissa's tear-bright eyes, at the desperate hope warring with resigned grief on that small face, I promise, Jean whispered. Melissa crashed into her arm and holding on like Jean was the only solid thing in a world that kept shifting. Over the child's head, Jean caught sight of Nicholas standing in the hallway, half hidden in shadow. His expression was unreadable, but he'd heard every word. That night, after Melissa had finally fallen asleep, clutching Jean's hand, Nicholas found her in the garden. She'd come out here to breathe, to think, to consider whether she'd just made a promise that would get her killed. The night air was cool, scented with rosemary, and something darker, cigarette smoke from the guards posted at the perimeter. They're talking about you, Nicholas said without preamble. He materialized from the darkness like he was made of it, hands in his pockets, face half lit by the kitchen's glow. My men. I know. Jean didn't turn around. I'm a liability, an unknown, a possible threat. Are you? No. She finally looked at him. But does it matter what I say? You built your life on not trusting anyone. Nicholas moved closer, stopping a few feet away. They think I've gone soft, that you've compromised my judgment. Have I? The question seemed to catch him off guard. He was quiet for a long moment, his jaw working. Yes, he said finally, and the admission sounded like it cost him. You have. Jean's breath caught. I've run this organization for 12 years, Nicholas continued, his voice low and rough. I've survived 3 attempted coups, 2 federal investigations, and more betrayals than I can count. I've done it by trusting no one, by keeping everyone at a distance. He paused. And then you walked into my daughter's life and made her laugh. And I. He stopped, seeming to struggle with the words. You what? Jean prompted softly. I forgot to be afraid of you, and that terrifies them. Should it terrify you? Nicholas looked at her then, really looked, his dark eyes searching hers for deception. I don't know, should it? I'm not a spy, Nicholas. I'm not working for anyone. She gestured helplessly. I'm just trying to help a little girl who's drowning. That's all. That's all, he repeated, something like wonder in his voice. You really believe that's simple? It should be. Nothing in my world is simple. Jean turned to face him fully. Then maybe you need a different world. Maybe that's what Melissa needs. Not more guards, not more security protocols. Just a father who's present, who's soft when it matters. The words hung between them, dangerous and true. Nicholas's expression darkened. Soft men in my position end up dead. Their families end up dead. And hard men? Jean challenged. What do they end up with? Daughters who flinch when they come home? Empires built on fear and no one to share them with when it's over? You have no idea. I know you're exhausted. Jean's voice gentled. I can see it. The weight you carry and trying to be untouchable. Maybe your men think you've gone soft. But maybe softness is what your daughter needed to live. To actually live, not just survive. Nicholas stared at her. No one spoke to him like this. No one dared. But he didn't silence her. Didn't walk away. Didn't do any of the things Jean had braced herself for. Instead, he said quietly, they won't stop. The whispers, the suspicion. Victor thinks you're a threat to everything we've built. Then maybe I should. No. The word was sharp, final. You made Melissa a promise, and he took a breath. I'm making you one. Nothing will happen to you while you're under my protection. I don't care what they think. Nicholas, they work for me, not the other way around. And if keeping you safe means reminding them of that, so be it. Jean felt something shift between them. The weight of a decision made, a line crossed. Why, she asked. Why risk division in your organization for someone you barely know? Nicholas stepped closer, close enough that she could see the exhaustion in the lines of his face, the vulnerability he usually buried beneath steel. Because you're the first person in 6 months who made my daughter believe the world wasn't ending. And maybe, his voice dropped to barely a whisper, maybe you're the first person in longer than that who made me believe it too. The next morning, Jean noticed the new guard posted outside the kitchen. Young, professional, watching everything with trained eyes. Teresa mentioned casually that Jean's bedroom lock had been upgraded. Orders from Monsieur Daniel. And when Victor passed Jean in the hallway, his expression barely concealing his anger, she saw Nicholas emerge from his office, positioned perfectly to observe the interaction. A silent message. Touch her and answer to me. Jean should have felt safer. Instead, she felt the walls closing in. Protection was another kind of cage, and she was beginning to wonder if she'd ever be free of this one. Le Verre d'Or glittered like a jewel box. The charity dinner had been Nicholas's idea, a fundraiser for children's hospitals, the kind of public relations gesture that made dangerous men look civilized. The restaurant had been transformed. White roses on every table, champagne flowing like water, a string quartet playing Vivaldi in the corner. Jean had insisted on catering personally. If Melissa was going to be there, she wanted to ensure the child had something familiar, something safe. She'd spent the afternoon preparing delicate pastries, shaping sugar flowers that dissolved on the tongue like snow. Now she stood near the kitchen entrance in her white chef's coat, watching Melissa at Nicholas's table. The girl wore a cream-colored dress and kept glancing back at Jean every few minutes, checking that she was still there. Jean smiled each time, a silent reassurance. I'm here. You're safe. She should have known better. Safety was an illusion in Nicholas's world. It started with the lights. They flickered once, twice, then steadied. Guests glanced up nervously, laughed it off. The quartet continued playing. Waiters circulated with wine. But Jean felt it, a shift in the air, a wrongness she couldn't name. Her years in the monastery had taught her to trust those instincts, to recognize when violence was gathering like a storm, and she moved toward Melissa's table without thinking. That's when the front windows exploded. Glass erupted inward in a crystalline wave. Screams cut through the music. The quartet's violinist went down, blood blooming across his white shirt. People dove under tables, champagne glasses shattering against marble. Jean's body moved on autopilot. She sprinted toward Melissa as armed men poured through the shattered windows. 6 of them, masked, carrying automatic weapons that looked like they'd been pulled from a war zone. "Get down!" Nicholas roared, already shoving Melissa beneath the table. His gun appeared from nowhere, his bodyguards forming a wall around him. But the attackers weren't after Nicholas. "The girl!" one of them shouted in accented English. "Take the girl!" Time slowed to syrup. Jean watched a masked man raise his weapon toward the table where Melissa huddled, her small body visible through the gap between tablecloth and floor. Saw his finger tighten on the trigger, saw Nicholas realize he couldn't reach his daughter in time. Jean threw herself forward. She hit Melissa like a linebacker, covering the child's body with her own, curling around her as the world exploded into noise. Wood splintered above them as bullets chewed through the table. Crystal rained down like deadly snow. The chandelier overhead swayed, groaning. Melissa was screaming. High, terrified sounds muffled against Jean's chest. Jean held her tighter, making herself as large as possible, a human shield between the child and the chaos. Gunfire erupted from multiple directions. Nicholas's men returning fire, guests running for exits, the attackers advancing. The air filled with smoke and the copper smell of blood. Something punched Jean's left shoulder. Sudden, hot, wrong. She gasped, her grip on Melissa faltering. Pain bloomed white-hot through her chest and down her arm. No, not yet. Hold on. She forced her arms to stay locked around Melissa, even as warmth spread across her back, soaking through her chef's coat. The child was sobbing, trembling, but alive. Whole. That was all that mattered. More gunshots, closer now. The table above them disintegrated, showering them with splinters. Jean curled tighter, ignoring the way her vision was starting to blur at the edges. Just a little longer. Just keep her safe a little longer. Then, silence. Not complete silence. There were still screams, sirens in the distance, the crackle of something burning. But the gunfire had stopped. "Clear!" someone shouted. Victor's voice. Jean's arms were locked, frozen in position. She couldn't seem to make them release Melissa. "Jean?" The child's voice was muffled. "Jean, you're squishing me." "Sorry," Jean whispered, but her body wouldn't cooperate. Couldn't move. Then hands were pulling at her. Gentle, urgent. "Jean, let me see her." Nicholas's voice, raw, desperate, in a way she'd never heard. Jean's arms finally unlocked. She rolled onto her side, every movement sending lightning through her shoulder. Through tears and smoke, she saw Nicholas pulling Melissa out, running his hands over his daughter's face, her arms, checking for injuries. "Papa, I'm okay. Jean saved me." "Papa, something's wrong with Jean." Nicholas's eyes found her then, found the blood spreading beneath her, the way her white coat was no longer white. His face went ash pale. "Medic!" he roared, the word tearing from his throat. "Get a medic now!" Jean tried to say she was fine, but her tongue felt thick. The ceiling above her was beautiful, ornate plasterwork she'd never noticed before. The chandelier hung crooked now, half its crystals missing. Nicholas was suddenly there, kneeling beside her. His hands that had killed men, that ruled an empire through fear, shook as they pressed against her shoulder. "Jean, look at me, stay with me." His voice cracked. "Don't you dare, don't you fucking dare." She'd never heard him scared before. "Melissa?" Jean managed. "She's fine, you—" His jaw clenched, tears gathering in his eyes. "You took the bullet. It was meant for her and you—" "Good," Jean whispered. "No, not good. Nothing about this is—" He couldn't finish, just pressed harder against her shoulder, trying to stop the bleeding, his expensive suit soaking crimson. Jean reached up with her good hand, her fingers finding his face. He was crying now, openly. This man who showed the world nothing but stone. "She's okay," Jean said, each word an effort. "That's all that matters." "You matter." The words came out fierce, broken. "You think I can— that Melissa can—" He bent over her, his forehead nearly touching hers. Please, Jean." Stay. It wasn't a command, it was a prayer. Voices shouted nearby. Someone was saying something about ambulances, about getting them out. Dmitri appeared above her, his face grim, already on his phone coordinating logistics. But Jean only saw Nicholas. Saw the way he held her like she was made of glass. Like letting go meant losing everything. I'm not going anywhere, she whispered, echoing Melissa's words from weeks ago. Promise. His laugh was half sob. Don't make promises you can't keep. Learned from the best. The world was fading at the edges, going soft and gray. But she could still see Melissa's face appearing over Nicholas's shoulder, tear-stained, terrified, but alive. So beautifully, miraculously alive, Jean's eyes slipped closed. The last thing she felt was Nicholas's hand in hers, holding on like she was the only thing keeping him from drowning. And maybe she was. Later, Victor would tell the others how he'd found them under the broken chandelier, the boss on his knees in his daughter's blood and the chefs refusing to leave until the paramedics physically moved him. How he'd watched the most dangerous man in the city break down over a woman he'd known for 6 weeks. How Nicholas had climbed into the ambulance and rode with her, still holding her hand, still whispering things Victor couldn't hear. And how, for the first time in 12 years of service, Victor had seen his boss afraid. Not of death, not of enemies or federal investigations or coups, but of losing someone who'd made him remember what it felt like to be human. That, Victor realized, was the most dangerous thing of all. Pain woke Joan before consciousness did. It radiated from her left shoulder in waves, hot, insistent, demanding attention. She tried to move and immediately regretted it, a gasp escaping through clenched teeth. Easy. A hand pressed gently against her good shoulder. Don't try to sit up yet. Nicholas's voice, close. Jean forced her eyes open, blinking against soft lamplight. She wasn't in a hospital. The ceiling above her was wood-beamed and unfamiliar. Through windows to her left, she saw dense forest pressing close, trees so thick they blocked out the sky. The room was small, sparse, a bed, a chair, a dresser. Safe house, her mind supplied. Nicholas sat beside her bed in the chair he'd clearly been occupying for hours. His suit jacket was gone, his white shirt wrinkled and stained with rust-colored marks. Blood. Her blood. Stubble shadowed his jaw, and his eyes were red-rimmed with exhaustion. Melissa? Jean croaked, her throat raw. Asleep in the next room. Unharmed. His hand moved to a water glass on the nightstand. Here, slowly. He helped her drink, his hand steady beneath her head, even though his eyes betrayed everything his hands didn't. Terror, relief, guilt so heavy it seemed to age him. How long? Jean asked when she could speak again. 36 hours. The bullet went through your shoulder, missed the major vessels. You lost a lot of blood. His jaw tightened. The doctor said another inch to the right. He didn't finish. Didn't need to. Jean looked down at herself. Someone had dressed her in soft cotton pajamas, her left arm immobilized in a sling. Clean bandages peeked from beneath the fabric, expertly wrapped. Who did this? She asked. I did. She looked up sharply. You? The doctor showed me how. I've been changing them every 6 hours. His voice was flat, clinical, but his hands betrayed him. They shook slightly as he set down the water glass. I couldn't trust anyone else. Not after Nicholas. Jean's good hand found his. His fingers closed around hers immediately, desperately. What happened after? His expression darkened. 5 of them dead. 1 escaped. We've identified who sent them. The Conti family. They thought taking Melissa would give them leverage, force me to yield territory. His voice went cold, lethal. They were wrong. How many of your men? 3 injured, none dead. You were the only one who... He stopped, his throat working. When he looked at her again, his eyes were raw. You threw yourself in front of a bullet meant for my daughter. Why? You know why? No, I don't. He leaned forward, his intensity filling the space between them. You've worked for me for 6 weeks. Melissa isn't your child. This isn't your war. You could have run, hidden, saved yourself. Instead, you... His voice broke. Why would you do that? Jean met his gaze steadily. Because she's 4 years old and she's already lost her mother. Because someone had to love her enough to make sure she didn't lose everything else too. She paused. Because maybe I'm tired of watching children pay for adults' violence. Nicholas stared at her, something crumbling behind his eyes. I watched 3 of my men carry you out covered in blood, he said hoarsely. I thought you were dead. I thought. He pressed the heels of his hands against his eyes. I've lost people. I've buried soldiers, friends, my wife, but watching you. He dropped his hands, and Jean saw tears there. I wanted to burn the world down. Don't. They tried to take my daughter. They shot you. Vengeance won't change what happened, Jean said quietly. It'll just add more bodies to the pile. Nicola's laugh was harsh. You don't understand how this works. If I don't retaliate, I look weak. Other families will see an opening. There'll be more attacks, more attempts. I have to respond. With more violence, more death? Jean struggled to sit up, ignoring his protest. And what does Melissa learn from that? That the only answer to pain is to cause more of it? I'm protecting her. You're teaching her that love looks like vengeance. That the way to honor someone's sacrifice is to make sure it wasn't the last one. Jean's voice strengthened despite her exhaustion. I didn't take that bullet so you could use it as an excuse to start a war. Then what was I supposed to do? Nicholas stood abruptly, pacing to the window. Let them get away with it? Show everyone that Nicholas Daniels' family is an acceptable target? I don't know, Jean admitted. But I know that whatever peace Melissa's found these past weeks, that fragile, beautiful thing where she laughs and rolls dough and sleeps through the night, vengeance will destroy it. You go to war, and she loses you too. Maybe not physically, but she'll lose the father who's learning to be soft. The one who sits at dinner and listens to her stories. That man dies the moment you walk out that door with murder in your heart. Nicholas's shoulders went rigid. You're asking me to do nothing. I'm asking you to think about what matters more, your reputation or your daughter's soul. He turned on her, fury and anguish warring on his face. You have no idea what you're asking. The cost of appearing weak in my world, is it more than the cost of becoming the thing Melissa fears? The question hung between them like a blade. Before Nicholas could answer, the bedroom door creaked open. Melissa stood there in her nightgown, her rabbit clutched tight, her eyes wide and frightened. Papa? Her voice was tiny. Why are you yelling? Nicholas's expression immediately softened. I'm sorry, Piccola. I didn't mean to wake you. Are you leaving? Melissa's bottom lip trembled. I heard you talking about going away. Just for a little while. No. Melissa crossed the room quickly, grabbing his hand with both of hers. You can't. You promised you'd stay. You promised we'd be safe here. And I'll make sure you are. But I have to take care of some things first. You're going to hurt people. It wasn't a question. Melissa looked up at her father with the eyes too knowing for a 4-year-old, like the men who hurt Jean. Nicholas crouched down, eye level with his daughter. Yes, they hurt someone we care about. They tried to hurt you. I have to make sure they never do that again. Melissa was quiet for a long moment, her small face thoughtful. Then she said so softly Jean almost missed it. Jean says hurting people won't make Mama happy. Nicholas froze. When I got angry and broke things, Melissa continued, Jean told me that Mama wouldn't want me to be mean, that Mama would want me to be kind, even when I'm sad. She squeezed her father's hand. If you hurt those people, will Mama be happy? The question shattered something in Nicholas's face. Jean watched him struggle, saw the war raging behind his eyes, years of violence and survival instincts battling against the simple wisdom of a child who'd learned peace from a woman who'd nearly died for her. No, he finally whispered, his voice breaking. No, Piccola. She wouldn't. Then don't go. Melissa's eyes filled with tears. Please, Papa. Jean almost died. I don't want you to die too. I don't want to lose everybody. Nicholas pulled his daughter into his arms, holding her like she was the only solid thing in a world coming apart. Over her head, his eyes found Jean's. She saw the moment he made his choice. Saw the fearsome Mafia boss let his 4-year-old daughter talk him down from the ledge. Saw him choose love over vengeance. Saw him become, finally, the father Melissa needed. I'm not going anywhere, he murmured into Melissa's hair, I promise. I'm staying right here. Melissa sobbed once, relief shaking her small frame, and held on tighter. Jean closed her eyes, exhaustion and pain pulling her back toward sleep. But before darkness took her, she felt Nicholas's hand find hers again. And this time, she held on just as tight. 3 days after the attack, Victor came to the safe house with news. Jean was in the kitchen, moving slowly, her arm still in its sling, making Melissa's breakfast when she heard the urgent voices from the study. Nicholas, Victor, Dmitri, words like traitor and location confirmed, and tonight drifted through the walls. She knew that tone, had heard it in the monastery the night Brother Thomas died, men deciding that violence was the only answer. Her hands stilled on the whisk. When Nicholas emerged an hour later, his face was carved from stone. He found her in the garden, where she'd gone to sit with her coffee, to breathe air that didn't smell like antiseptic and fear. "I know where they are," he said without preamble. "The ones who planned the attack. My own man sold us out to the Countess. Gave them our location, Melissa's schedule, everything." His voice was eerily calm. "I'm leaving tonight." "To do what? What needs to be done?" Jean set down her cup carefully. "You promised Melissa you'd stay. I promised to keep her safe. This is how I do that." He crouched beside her chair, his eyes hard. "They tried to kill my daughter, Jean. They shot you. I can't let that stand." "So you're going to kill them?" "Yes." The word hung between them, simple and final. Jean studied his face, the determination there, the cold fury that had resurfaced after days of vulnerability. This was the Nicholas his enemies knew, the one who ruled through fear and swift retribution. "Where?" she asked. "Le Ver d'Or. They're using it as a meeting place. Think we won't come back there. Think I'm too weak now to—" He stopped. "It doesn't matter. I'm ending this tonight." Jean stood, ignoring the pull in her shoulder. "Then I'm coming with you." "Absolutely not. You can barely—" "I'm not letting you go alone, Jean." His voice gentle despite everything. "You're injured. You've already—" "I'm coming," she repeated, steel in her voice. "You want to do this? Fine. But you don't do it without someone there to remind you who you really are." Nicholas stared at her. "You think you can stop me?" "No, but maybe I can save you." They left after Melissa fell asleep, and Teresa watching over her with strict instructions and armed guards positioned throughout the safe house. Jean rode in silence beside Nicholas in the back of the SUV, watching the city lights blur past. Le Ver d'Or rose before them like a ghost. The windows had been boarded up, yellow police tapes still fluttering in the wind. The front entrance was dark, but light leaked from the service entrance and back. Nicholas's men had already surrounded the building. Victor met them at the rear door, his expression grim. 3 inside. Marco is one of them, the traitor. The other 2 are Conti soldiers. He handed Nicholas a gun. "We can breach in 60 seconds. "No." Nicholas checked the weapon with practiced efficiency. "I go in alone. Boss, alone." His tone left no room for argument. Then his eyes cut to Jean. "You stay here." "No." "Jean, for once, I didn't survive a bullet to watch you throw away everything we've built." She met his glare with her own. "I'm walking through that door with you, or I'm walking through it behind you. Your choice." A muscle ticked in his jaw. Then, surprisingly, he nodded. "Stay behind me. If shooting starts, you run." She didn't agree, just followed him inside. The restaurant looked like a crime scene frozen in time. Broken glass still littered the floor. Tables remained overturned. Dark stains marked the marble where people had bled, where she had bled, saving Melissa. Voices echoed from the main dining room, casual, unconcerned. They didn't know death was walking toward them. Nicholas moved like a shadow, his gun raised, each step silent. Jean stayed close, her heart hammering, her injured arm throbbing. They reached the doorway. Nicholas didn't hesitate, just stepped through, his weapon trained on the 3 men sitting at what used to be his private table. "Evening, gentlemen." The men scrambled up, reaching for weapons, but Nicholas's men poured in behind him, guns aimed, exits blocked. The Conti soldiers froze, hands raised. But it was the 3rd man Jean focused on, Marco, one of Nicholas's lieutenants. Mid-40s, with eyes that couldn't quite meet his boss's. "Nicolas," Marco's voice shook. "I can explain. You sold out my daughter." Nicholas's voice was terrifyingly calm. "Gave them her schedule, told them about the charity dinner, How much did they pay you, Marco? What was her life worth? They threatened my family. So you sacrificed mine? Nicholas moved closer, his gun never wavering. To his men, take the Conti trash outside. I'll deal with them after. Victor and Dmitri dragged the two soldiers out, leaving Marco alone with Nicholas and Jean. Please. Marco backed up until he hit the wall. Please. I didn't know they'd shoot. They said they just wanted leverage. A 4-year-old child. Nicholas's control was fracturing. And John, his voice broke slightly. She almost died because of you. I'm sorry. Sorry? Nicholas raised the gun, aimed at Marco's head. His hand was steady, his expression empty. Jean had seen that look before, on men who'd left their humanity behind. This was the moment, the line he couldn't uncross. Jean stepped forward despite the screaming pain in her shoulder. Her hand found Nicholas's wrist, not grabbing, not pulling, just resting there. Trembling, a connection. Nicholas, she said softly. Don't. His voice was rough. He deserves this. Maybe, but Melissa doesn't deserve to lose you to it. She won't lose me. Yes, she will. Jean moved closer until she stood beside him, until she could see his face. Tears tracked silently down his cheeks, even as his gun hand remained steady. You kill him, and you become the same man who left her alone with her grief for 6 months. The man who chose violence over everything. You do this, and Melissa grows up in the same hell you did, watching her father become a monster, learning that love means vengeance, that pain can only be answered with more pain. He tried to kill you, Nicholas whispered. He tried to take her. I can't. Can't what? Let him live? Or can't let yourself be better than what the world expects? Her fingers pressed gently against his wrist. You've spent your whole life proving you're strong enough to kill. Prove you're strong enough not to. Marco sobbed against the wall, reduced to begging in Italian. Nicholas's hand shook, his finger on the trigger, his daughter's words echoing. Jean says hurting people won't make Mama happy. Seconds stretched into eternity. Then, slowly, painfully, Nicholas lowered the gun. The silence that followed was deafening. Marco collapsed, gasping. Nicholas stood there, weapon at his side, his whole body trembling with the effort of restraint. When he turned to Jean, his face was devastated. You make me weak, he said, his voice breaking. Jean reached up with her good hand, cupping his face gently. No, I make you human. He stared at her, this man who'd built an empire on fear, who'd survived by being untouchable, and then he broke. Nicholas dropped the gun and pulled her against him, careful of her injury, his face pressed into her neck. His shoulders shook with silent sobs. I wanted to kill him, he whispered. I wanted to make them all pay. I know. Jean held him as tightly as her one good arm allowed. But you didn't. You chose something harder. You chose to live with the anger instead of spreading it. Around them, his men stood frozen, witnessing their boss weep in the arms of the chef who'd saved his daughter. Victor caught Jean's eye over Nicholas's shoulder. She expected judgment, resentment. Instead, he nodded once. Respect. When Nicholas finally straightened, his eyes were red but clear. He turned to Marco, who cowered against the wall. You're out, Nicholas said, his voice empty. Out of the family, out of the city, out of my sight. You have 24 hours to disappear. If I ever see you again, choice or not, I will finish this. Marco scrambled up and ran. Nicholas watched him go, then looked down at the gun in his hand like he didn't recognize it. He set it carefully on the overturned table. What now? He asked Jean quietly. She laced her fingers through his. Now we go home to your daughter, and we teach her that the strongest thing her father ever did wasn't pulling a trigger. What was it? Not pulling it. Nicholas nodded slowly. Then he did something that shocked everyone in the room. He raised Jean's hand to his lips and kissed her knuckles, gentle, reverent, public. A declaration. Outside engines started. Men dispersed into the night. The restaurant stood empty again, its ghost settling back into silence. But something had changed. Nicholas Daniel had chosen mercy, and the world would never look at him or Jean the same way again. The sign went up on a Tuesday morning in late spring. Maison Melissa in elegant gold script, catching sunlight like a promise. Jean stood across the street, her arm finally free of its sling, watching workers remove the last of the police tape from Le Verre d'Or's entrance. Except it wasn't Le Verre d'Or anymore. Nicholas had bought it outright, renovated it top to bottom, and was reopening it as something new. Not a front for money laundering. Not a place where fear walked alongside power. Just a restaurant. One where a little girl's laughter would replace the echoes of gunfire. What do you think? Nicholas's voice came from beside her. He'd appeared silently, hands in his pockets, looking almost nervous. Jean glanced at him. He'd changed in the 6 weeks since that night, moved differently, carried himself with less armor. He still ran his organization, still commanded respect. But Victor had mentioned that Nicholas had started turning down certain jobs, redirecting the family's interest toward legitimate businesses, slow changes. Careful ones, changes that started with choosing not to pull a trigger. I think Melissa will love it, Jean said. And you? She smiled. I think it's the second best decision you've ever made. What was the first? Letting a stranger calm your daughter with a touch. Nicholas's expression softened. Best decision I never knew I was making. The grand reopening was small, intimate. Just family, though what that word meant had shifted. Victor was there with his wife. Dmitri brought his teenage son. Therese had made her famous tiramisu. Even the line cooks from the old Le Verre d'Or had returned, drawn by the promise of something different. And at the center of it all, Melissa. She wore a white dress and a chef's toque that kept sliding over her eyes, making her giggle every time Jean adjusted it. They'd spent the morning in the new kitchen, state-of-the-art equipment gleaming, windows overlooking a garden where herbs grew in boxes Melissa had planted herself. Can we make the bread now? Melissa asked for the third time, bouncing on her toes. Patience, Jean reminded gently, measuring flour into a large ceramic bowl. Patience makes sweetness last. But I've been patient forever, and it's been 5 minutes, sweetheart. That's forever, Jean laughed, something she found herself doing more often these days, and she handed Melissa a smaller bowl with pre-measured ingredients. Okay, remember what I taught you? Melissa nodded seriously. Mix dry first, then add wet. Then we wait for the magic. The magic being yeast, Melissa announced proudly. It makes the bread grow. They worked side by side, Melissa narrating each step like she was hosting a cooking show. When Jean turned to get the olive oil, she caught sight of Nicholas in the kitchen doorway. He was just watching. No phone, no bodyguards hovering, no urgent business pulling him away. Just a father observing his daughter coat herself in flour while learning to make something from nothing. The look on his face made Jean's chest tighten. Papa! Melissa spotted him and waved frantically, sending a cloud of flour into the air. Look, Jean's teaching me to make real bread, not the store kind. I see that. Nicholas stepped fully into the kitchen, his expensive shoes somehow not bothering him as he walked through the mess on the floor. Can I help? Melissa's eyes went wide. You want to? If you'll teach me. Jean, Papa wants to learn. Melissa turned to her, flour on her nose, her cheeks, and her hair. Can we teach him? Jean met Nicholas's gaze over the child's head, saw the question there, not about bread, but about belonging, about whether he was allowed in this space they'd built together. She smiled. I think we can manage that. Go wash your hands. An hour later, 3 loaves sat rising on the marble counter, lumpy, imperfect, made with 6 hands instead of 2. Melissa had gone to show Teresa her handiwork, leaving Jean and Nicholas alone in the kitchen. He stood beside her at the sink, washing flour from beneath his nails. I built an empire out of fear, he said quietly, not looking at her. You tore it down with kindness. Jean dried her hands slowly. I didn't tear anything down. I just showed you what was already there underneath. Whatever was there is because of you. He turned to face her, leaning against the counter. 6 months ago, my daughter wouldn't speak. I was drowning in guilt and rage. He gestured at the kitchen, the restaurant beyond, the life taking shape around them. None of this existed. It existed, Jean corrected softly. You just couldn't see it yet. Then you gave me new eyes. She moved closer until they stood arm's length apart. So what do we do with them? Build something worth feeding, Nicholas said, echoing words she'd spoken weeks ago. Not an empire? No. Something better. His hand lifted, hesitant, asking permission. When Jean didn't move away, he brushed flour from her cheek, his touch gentle. Something that makes Melissa laugh. That lets me sleep at night. That means you stay. I'm not going anywhere, Jean said. Promise? Haven't I already? Nicholas's smile was small, real. You have. I just needed to hear it again. Their hands found each other across the marble counter, the same counter where glass had once shattered, where fear had reigned. Now it held rising bread and the possibility of something neither of them had dared hope for. Peace. Not the absence of violence, but the presence of love strong enough to choose differently. Jane, Papa, come see. Melissa's voice rang through the restaurant. They found her in the dining room, standing in the middle of the space where chaos had erupted months ago. But now the windows were whole, filled with afternoon light. New tables gleamed, fresh flowers sat in simple vases, and Melissa was laughing, spinning in circles, her arms spread wide. It's beautiful, she declared. It's the most beautiful place in the whole world. Nicholas scooped her up and she threw her flower-covered arms around his neck. You really think so? Yes, and when people come, we can make them bread, and they'll be happy and nobody will be sad anymore. Jean's throat tightened. Such a simple dream from a child who'd known too much darkness. Come here, Melissa commanded, reaching for Jean. Both of you, together. Jean stepped close. Melissa grabbed her hand with one small fist and her father's with the other, linking them together. And there, the little girl said, satisfied. This is how it should be. All of us. Jean looked down at their joined hands, hers dark against Melissa's pale, small fingers. Nicholas's scarred and strong, supporting both. Flour dusted all three, marking them as partners in creation rather than destruction. Nicholas met her eyes over his daughter's head. No words needed. Just understanding. That they'd found something precious in the ruins. That they'd chosen it every day since. That they would keep choosing it. Around them, the restaurant hummed with life. Victor laughed at something Dmitri said. Teresa called someone to help carry trays. Music played softly. Not Vivaldi this time, but something warmer, jazz with soul. And in the center of it all, three people who'd been broken by violence and found healing in gentleness. A mafia boss learning that strength looked like mercy. A monk who'd fled peace, finding it in the last place she expected. And a little girl teaching them both that love was the bravest thing of all. Outside, the spring sun set over the city, painting the windows gold. Inside Maison Melissa, laughter filled the space where fear once lived. And somewhere, perhaps watching, perhaps simply felt, a mother's spirit rested, knowing her daughter was finally beautifully home.